Good morning, everyone. How is everybody? Me too. Got more sunshine inside today than we do outside. It's very nice to be together. For those who don't know us, my name is Swami Daiva, and this is Swami Gangamata. So, we are in the midst of a great and global upheaval. Everywhere you turn, there is chaos, mayhem, many places outward violence, there's confusion. There's actually, each one of us was born for this time and into this time because there's something very specific for each one of us to glean. That's why our souls chose to be here. And there are both very personal and specific things to learn, but also some very universal things. And a part of that universality brings us together in worship, in aspiration. All of us know there's something more. In fact, I would say at this point on the planet, everyone is aware that something more is needed. And, you know, we tend to pull on such things as, gosh, if we just got rid of gluten, everything would be okay. Or maybe it's being non-dairy. Certainly it's getting rid of GMOs. If we just got rid of the Taliban and ISIS, then we could be happy. There's an enormous amount of truth to all the things that we aspire to. But Swami Kriyananda used to talk about life. And by extension, Swami Kriyananda is the founder of Ananda, if you don't know who he is. He was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, the author of Autobiography of a Yogi. He spent the last 3.5 years, Kriyananda did, of his life in direct attunement and training by Yogananda to help carry these global changing, these world-changing understandings and perceptions. And Ananda is founded in direct line with that to help change the planet. There was a Portlandia show that I heard about. I didn't see it. But an episode where somebody in the show died of confusion. Because they were trying to do it all right. And even though that's very funny, many of us find ourselves in that puzzle and in that predicament. And outwardly, it goes from thing to thing to thing. I remember back many, many, many years ago, protesting against Roundup and glyphosate. This is 35 years ago. And against kind of the wholesale abuse of our environment. And I was part of Beyond War, and I lived on a little organic farm in the middle of Northern California, and got rid of my car and my credit cards and rode a bicycle everywhere, and I was very, very, very earth-toned. And it felt really good. And I woke up one day and I realized that my best effort was never going to be enough, and the world just wasn't that interested. And it was around that time, because I've always been a seeker, I've always wondered, just like all of you, I've always wanted to know, how does life work? Where does lasting meaning come from? And how do we connect to it in a meaningful way? Around that time, somebody handed me the Autobiography of a Yogi, and they said, what you're looking for may not be outside you. What you're looking for may not be out there in all the many things that do and truly need to change. But what's happened to Monsanto and GMOs and all of those, and Roundup and stuff? They're still here, you know. And what's happened to Beyond War? Well, we've just gone into different wars. You know, we've just gone from one thing to the next, which is the nature of the world. To go, you clean up one mess and some other mess shows up and then you have to attend to that. As long as we try and solve it outwardly. Again, Swami Kriyananda had a great metaphor. He said it's a little like trying to wash a shirt in a tub of water. No matter where you push down, the shirt bubbles up someplace else. You can never get the whole shirt underwater. I don't know why that is, but there it is. And that's what happens for us. We get it solved in one place, and we just end up having to go and solve life somewhere else. And I found myself becoming inert with frustration and lack of understanding how to be properly engaged. I started to practice what I found. I'm going to go back half a step. What I found in reading the autobiography of a yogi was I found someone finally who had it figured out. And it wasn't because the world worked for them particularly well outwardly, although it always ultimately resolved that way, but because no matter what was going on, they found the reservoir of wholeness, and that all of the experiences of life wove themselves into a tapestry of meaning specific to them and specific to a relationship to the entire world, which is what we want. We want to know that our lives are meaningfully connected to the whole story and that there's a purpose to it, that the things that come to us aren't just random. One friend of mine, just before the path, she described herself after the path as before the path feeling like she was a hockey puck. And she was just kind of, felt like she was on the ice of life, just kind of going along like this, and all of a sudden the stick of life would just kind of slap her and she'd go skating across the ice and land over someplace else. And pretty soon she was like that, and all of a sudden just slapped. And it was just always random and very, very unpredictable. It was only when she started to connect from inside out. What Yogananda taught was that this mixture, this blend of outer activity and has to be connected to inner communion, and that the power of our inner communion, the power, he said, the time for knowing God has come, not the time for speculating, not the time for theorizing, not the time for reading books alone, but for listening. And I'm going to read from Yogananda's book, the book of his talks, The Divine Romance. I'm going to read from it in a minute, and you'll hear these same things echoed. But he said, we are in a world that demands great and focused participation. We're not in a time where being little Himalayan yogis and just going into the monastery and meditating and communing with God is enough. But to be active outwardly without deep inner communion leaves us frustrated, empty, restless, and less ourselves. We had a very interesting connection. We periodically go to India, take people to India, travel to India on pilgrimage in the footsteps of these great masters. Because these masters really came to bring a new and deeper understanding of how life works to all of us. And so we go there and tune in deeply for a month at a time. We're going again, for anybody who's interested, we're going again in October. If you'd like to come along, we have some spots. But while we were there, in 1991 was the first time I went, and it was a month-long journey. And a part of our time was spent in Calcutta, where Yogananda grew up. And Mother Teresa happened to be in Calcutta at that time, alive and doing great work. And we got up one morning at 4 a.m. and got to her place where the nuns would do Mass in the morning. I believe they started at 5 or 5:30, but it was very early regardless. And it was very sweet, by the way. It was beautiful because we went in, and it was very holy, very simple, very, very uplifted. And Mother Teresa was celebrating the Mass, which was very unusual. But it was unusual for other reasons, because here you had all of these Indian women in nuns' habits kneeling in prayer. And in the back of the room, you had all these Western folks sitting in lotus posture, meditating. It was quite the juxtaposition, but it was so elevated. And afterwards, we spent some time with her. She was just this little tiny person. And her skin was virtually translucent at that point. And she just radiated this joy and this divine power. And in the conversation with her, she said, you know, I have work in, I think it was 90-some countries. There is God's work doing this, and that our job is to pick up the poorest of the poor. And she appended that with, do you know that the poorest of the poor are not actually the people we care for? They're not the people who are hungry. They're not the people who are homeless. The poorest of the poor are the people in your own country, she said, who have wealth, but do not have an inner life and are lonely. But she said, I want you to know that I do not pick up the people on the street because I think it's a good thing, though I do think it's a good thing. She said, I do not pick up the people on the street because I see Jesus in the people on the street, although I do see Jesus in the people on the street. She said, I pick up the people on the street because it's what God tells me to do. And you should do whatever God tells you to do. And if it's live in a mansion, you should do that. If it's pick up people on the street, you should do that. But whatever God asks of you. And then there's a cute story that goes with this where a journalist was talking with her and he said, oh, mother, I hear that you do God's will. And he expected kind of a simpering, well, yes, I do. And she said, well, of course I do. What do you do? Of course I do. What do you do? These things inspired me. This was early on in this was, 25 years ago or something? Very early on in my own spiritual efforts. And because I didn't have the privilege or the curse of having an income stream of my own, I had to work very hard to support my family. And I found I was always trying to do something good. And I realized that that's actually a theme that's trying to happen on this planet right now. So much so that I was thinking to do some writing last night, and I actually wrote down kind of in capitals, do something good. And I looked down, and actually my spell checker had changed it to do something God, which is today's topic. Because we can become so busy trying to do good things outwardly that we lose ourselves. And at the end of life, and the end of life is coming, soon or late for every one of us, all we have is the fruit of our day's actions as a composite. And if we've just been busy, Christ said it beautifully. He said, the poor ye have always with you, the problems ye have always with you. There will be no time where you clean up this world and make it perfect the way you know it ought to be, ever. So what's the point of doing good work? What do we do with our time? What matters in this world? We are in the midst of an enormous movement and upheaval of energy, trying to find a new way of relating to life at every level, environmentally, energy, socially, culturally, religiously. You know, we have people who celebrate the differences in the races and the cultures. We have people who feel that the differences are actually the cause of all the problems. And they're getting louder and louder and louder. We have people who are committed to the status quo, if we can just hold on, and ignoring, the great movement of energy that's feeling the burn, or, loving the dawn, or whatever the heck it is that's out there. There is that compulsion for change. What do we do about it? This is just, if you haven't read these books, there's a trilogy. It's The Divine Romance, it's Whispers from Eternity, and it's The Journey to Self-Realization. If you haven't read them, they're wonderful. There's just, this is Yogananda's voice and talks. This is from a chapter in Divine Romance called The Mind Repository of Infinite Power. And he says, he writes, and this is from 1939, he writes, "The Western point of view is that knowledge of God can be received through book learning. But one defect in this approach is that every study should have a practical as well as theoretical side. You can acquire a mental concept from a story you read in a book, but its practical value in daily life remains to be seen. All too often the intellect becomes satisfied with just a theory about God. Great and glorious is the story of God's presence, but greater and more glorious is the actual perception of the infinite. I speak only of what I have experienced, for personal experience is the practical aspect of religion." And then he says, "If you practice 1/1,000,000th of the things I say," this is very cute because early in his writings he would say, "If you practice 1/100th of what I say," and then he said years later, "If you practice 1,000th of what I say," and now he's saying even 1,000,000th because he said obviously a lot of things in between. "If you practice 1/1,000,000th of the things I tell you in these Thursday night meetings, you will reach God. Success doesn't lie in listening to my sermons, but in practicing what I have told you. Today you will learn how to develop the seeds of your innate God-given faculties of mind." If we had, more time, I would love to share much more of this with you. But he said, this is the time, and these teachings give us the power to be a force for goodness in the world. That the development, he said, every day, we should develop physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Every part of us should be taken out and exercised every single day. He said we should develop, he said the key to success in life is an ever-increasing dynamic willpower. And that willpower should be taken out and exercised in the performance of small things, combined with meditation, until our will becomes so dynamic that it becomes the all-powerful will of God. He said that we should, just as Swami Kriyananda, who's writing about Yogananda's teachings, he's giving them new clothing to help us understand more deeply. But he says, income, when seen as a material reality, is dead. But income seen as a stream of energy is alive, and it has the power. Instead of being something where we go and hoard and create bank accounts and we create this outer form of security, we get into a creative flow and we develop magnetism. And we use the practices, and I'm going to talk about his practices for just a minute. The practice of concentration given us in Hong Sa, deep inner concentration on spirit. Energization, the power to control life force. Om technique, communion with spirit, and then Kriya in the spine, which creates this tremendous magnetism and frees us from all the little pathways that fritter. It's like it cauterizes all the places where our life force gets bled out. So those things applied daily, inwardly, and then applied outwardly to daily activities, so will create in us a tremendous magnetism that allows us to create and fulfill anything that we can envision. So the mind, the repository of infinite power. We should awaken to that, every one of us. You know, it's interesting, we had a very fun experiment in Ananda community a few years back. We were trying to solve the problem, and it's a fairly mundane problem, but it had a lot of energy around it, we had to refinish the swimming pool. And there was a question, what color should the inside of the swimming pool be? Well, who really cares, for God's sake? But once the question got raised, everybody had an opinion. And it was a very interesting process because the man who was the head of our community at that point, he had a really strong opinion and he was in a position to exert it. And we talked about the fact that it might not be a really good idea, that it might be worth including other people in the conversation. Everybody had to live with it. And so he did, and of course he got, like 15 different solutions. And he was really stuck. But then he did something. We talked about it, and he did something which was fascinating. He called every single person that he had invited input from. And he said, I respect your sense of what you would like. It's wonderful. But let's try something new. Let's try and tune into what's trying to happen here. And use all of this energy that we're using to try and express our opinion about what we like, and try and use it inwardly to tune into what is trying to happen. You know what happened? Every single person came back with the exact same answer. Every single person came back with the exact same answer. And it's beautiful, and it works. There's a real secret that Yogananda and Kriyananda tried to help us understand. There's always something trying to happen that's in the best interest of everybody. And whereas when we work from the surface in our personalities, we're always expressing our own opinion, our likes and dislikes, the habits of the mind from incarnations. And often we miss the point. But when we go deep inside and we start to ask the question with real receptivity, what's trying to happen here? It's surprising how many times we all come up with the same understanding and perception and can lend our strength and our energy and our consciousness together to that. And out of that comes, many hands make a miracle. The miracles of Ananda come from just that simple process. And what happens is we end up living in this joyous freedom and wholeness on a day-by-day basis, feeling connected to the source of life. And it happens on small levels like the color of pool linings. But it happens on grand levels like the creation of Ananda Center at Laurelwood, a place that demonstrates increasingly, in conjunction with Ananda community here and Ananda communities around the world, but in a full-fledged, three-dimensional, all-of-life included way, that simple living and high thinking lead to the highest happiness. That there is a place and ways that we can do good things on a daily basis, not just randomly because they seem like they're good, but from deep inside in connection with the movement of spirit, cooperating with what's trying to happen. And all of a sudden our lives start to have a meaning and a fullness and a richness that feeds our inner reality and our inner connection with spirit, and also brings more beauty and harmony into this world. We'll end with just a little reading from Whispers from Eternity, Yogananda's book of prayer demands and poems. Inward and outward, prosperity. Yogananda said we should be, he said the second greatest art, next to the art of realizing God, is earning money honestly and industriously to serve God's work. And then he said to his disciples, he said, you should all earn as much as you possibly can, honestly and industriously, to serve God's work. If we see that in terms of cash, it's a very odd statement. If we see it in terms of the flow of energy that Swami Kriyananda was talking about, we understand that he's talking about we should engage in life with increasing dynamic receptivity and cooperation and participation. This is number 78, Demand for Prosperity. Thou art the Father, I am thy child. Thou art the Supreme Spirit, I am made in thine image. Thou art the Father, owner of the whole universe. I, good or naughty, am thy child, and when I behave, I have the right of possession over all that is thine. Alas, I have played the truant, wandering away from thy home of cosmic plenty. Lead me home again. Teach me to identify my highest interests with thy will. Rescue me from this shipwreck on the tiny island of my body. Expand my consciousness. Help me to understand once more that I am made in thy image. When by thy grace I discover that I, like thee, am omnipresent, then at last shall I have true dominion over all things, even as thou hast. Om Shanti. Amen. Let's take a moment of silence.